Welcome to Game Noir. A very smoky and shadowy panel.
All right. My name is Daniel Greenberg. I'm an adjunct professor at George Mason University, where I teach in the computer game design department. I'm also the founder of Winter Ion Game Studios, based here in the DC area. And you can find me on YouTube at Winter Ion.
I'm Alex Greenberg. I work at Bethesda Game Studios / ZeniMax Media. We are now part of the Microsoft Xbox family. I'm in the HR department there, and I also am an actor. I got my MFA in acting at the FSU Oslo Conservatory, and that's why I roped Daniel into this panel about actors and filmmaking and games. And
I promise there is game content.
yes, we'll get there.
Win the fight, bang, bang. She shot me down, bang, bang. And I hit the ground, bang, bang. Dead awful sound, bang, bang. My baby shot me down. Seasons came and changed the time. Laugh and say, remember when we used to play bang bang, and she shot me down bang bang, and I hit the ground bang bang, dead awful sound bang bang, my baby shot me down.
Here I'd feared you'd left all this behind.
So what exactly is film noir? It is the French term for black film, but more appropriately termed dark film. The term actually was not coined until the 70s, so it wasn't a term that they knew that they were making a style of film until way after the fact. The heyday that they were making these was in like the 40s and the 50s, and then when they started retrospectively looking at these films, they kind of like grouped them all together and coined them film noir. The definition is still debated by scholars and film critics because they haven't really classified it as a distinct genre. Most critics argue that it's more of a film style and it doesn't actually fall into a genre itself.
Right. And that style comes from a very specific place. It's primarily Europe. German Expressionism in the 1920s, during Weimar period Germany, the film industry is pretty well built up in Germany. It's one of the countries coming out of World War I that's really well equipped to make films. They've got a nationalized film industry. They have a lot of equipment that allows them to do things that are kind of new to film, like mobile filming, the ability to take the cameras outside of the studio and kind of utilize the space, in cities. This also allowed them to do things like simultaneous filming. You're not confined to the studio, so if the studio is the only place you can film, then you're stuck there. If you can get multiple cameras outside, you can shoot a lot more at once. It also helped with cost reduction. You can use existing scenery rather than having to build sets to emulate everything. These films started out, they were still silent films. One of the advantages of this kind of unintentionally is silent films, you have to do a lot of nonverbal communication, which means they really translate well internationally. So these are films that can speak a lot without having to rely on, too many text cards or too much, spoken dialogue because they can't communicate the spoken dialogue. And you get a lot of films that are very expressive, that use a lot of mise en scène and other sort of composite techniques to communicate beyond language. And that concept, everything that they did to build their scenes was kind of with that in mind. Distorted scenery, dramatic makeup, really stark presentations. Those different tools that were at their disposal all resulted in films that, were both very, very expressive and spoke well outside of their native Germany. I think the psychology of them. A lot of the expressionism is also kind of expanding beyond the literal communication of the scene. You can do things like, dream sequences, abstract landscapes. I think things like the cabinet of Dr. Cagliari.
Yeah, so they took mise en scene means like they setting the stage basically. So they took a lot of the things that you do in the theater, like painting a flat 2D tree, and you kind of make it abstract, and you paint blackness on it, or you like really paint somebody's makeup really dark to make them look like a vampire. They started bringing those techniques into filmmaking to make everything look a little like weird and funky and dark, and kind of how they were feeling after the First World War. They brought that sort of visual style into the psychology of like what you were watching, so you could get in the mind of the characters. And the best known example of this, I would say, is Fritz Lang's Metropolis, which he used a lot of mechanical sets, and he used a lot of Art Deco style to make these like huge buildings that were kind of like New York style buildings, but set in the future. And he made them like his little models. And much of the plot was taken from themes that he felt were coming out of the First World War, like industrialization, mass production, looking to America for like their modernity, and then fighting against fascism and communism. The film's message was encompassed in the final title slide: the mediator between the head and the hands must be the heart. And this kind of was the seed of film noir, and the artists who were in Germany at this time, like Hitchcock, Billy Wilder, and Fritz Lang, they all emigrated before the Second World War, and they took this art style with them, and that kind of became the impetus to start using these art styles in American films.
Yeah, and this brings things overseas. It's an example here of...
This is from Metropolis.
Yeah.
Those tiny little planes and that little train. It's crazy.
And this is where this style of filmmaking collides with America and the stories America is telling. Because in the 1920s, America, as the Roaring '20s, coming out of that, we hit the Great Depression. A lot of what was popular at that time were American crime dramas, novels, authors like Raymond Chandler. And these stories of pessimism and disillusionment make up the meat of the stories that would be told with early film noir. And it kind of stuck really throughout the genre. You had directors like John Huston, The Maltese Falcon, Orson Welles, American detective hard-boiled stories, stories of characters like Roy Earl or Dashiell Hammond, his pulp magazines, and fiction novels as well. Roger Ebert said of them, a movie which at no time misleads you into thinking there is going to be a happy ending. This was his second rule of noir.
Which, keep that in mind, though, for when you're building a game, you sometimes have to skew that a little bit, because then your character would just be dead. But at the time that these were made, a lot of these film noirs were not like the A-list, the great, well-paid team. These were a lot of the B movies. These were a lot of the experimental teams. These were the guys that were not paid a lot. These were the guys that were kind of like not allowed to use the studio space. They had to go out into the streets and kind of film their own things. But in a way that was sort of good because they were free from constraints of certain, like they didn't have to use linear plots like A-list movies had to use. They didn't have to, they didn't have to worry about like how they were dressing their women, although they were subject to enforcement by the Hays Code, which kind of, it stymied certain things like showing gratuitous violence, showing gratuitous sex scenes, but it sort of in a way made things a little bit sexier, a little bit sultrier, where you implied things were happening off stage and you didn't actually show it on camera. And historians were suggesting that noir works best during this climate of censorship. The crime genre fell beneath the suspicion, which allows writer and directors chances to subvert the cliches.
Yeah, it's that idea of more is said than unsaid, and it kind of pairs well with the themes, right, of the darkness, the mystery, and a lot of the shadow, both from the way the scenes are cast and from the stories that are told. A lot of films, where a lot of film noirs are made here, but there are a lot of films that are kind of tangential to film noir, aren't really film noir per se, but still had a big influence on the genre. Probably the largest of those is Citizen Kane. Orson Welles would, continue to do a lot of work in the noir space, but Citizen Kane's visual intricacy and its complexity made it a prime film to be aped and borrowed from in subsequent works.
And especially the voiceover narrative that continued throughout all of film noir. So they kind of took the way they were structured as a novel and took that inner monologue that you get to read and made it the outer monologue over all of noir.
So with those things in mind, let's chew a little on games.
He's never caught one spy, I'm told. He's never even caught a cold. Got his degree from Disneyland, but he's the last of the secret agents and he's my man. He's an underwhelming kind of sleuth. He thinks James Bond's some kind of suit. He's farther back than and also ran, but he's the last of the secret agents and he's my man. He'd come in third in a two-horse race. I've never had to slap his face. What a shame. But people try to understand. He's the last of the secret agents and he's my man.
If I had $1 for every trench coat,
So get going, partner.
So one of the things you immediately notice looking through a lot of this is where things are taking place. And setting is a huge part of film noir. It's period. It's mixing that European and American landscape and cynicism to sort of create its own setting. And the subtext of these films are dealing with a lot of the issues of the day. Film noir dealt with veterans coming home from war. It dealt with the increasing Red Scare in the United States, anxiety in the middle class. There were openings and opportunities to kind of tap into the feelings of the audience, and let them sort of experience that sort of collapse into, larceny and devastation that, happens with these sort of flawed protagonists. And L.A. Noir really, more than any other game or, that we sort of reviewed for this panel, captures the way those stories are told. Cole Phelps is a returning veteran from Okinawa who's rejoining the workforce by entering the LAPD. And as he rises through the ranks, you get to play through traffic and homicide, all the way up to vice. But Cole Phelps throughout the game is reliving some moments and trauma from his time overseas. He's struggling with personal demons. There's a period in the game where his tragic flaw is revealed, and that starts his sort of noir style downward spiral. The game touches on substance abuse, mental trauma, issues with veterans. It's very important that it takes place where it does, because the time and place that it's happening, 1949 Los Angeles, helps frame all of the elements of the plot. And it also draws heavily from those headlines for a lot of the games. I guess you'd call them missions. The game's very episodic. It feels almost like a TV show as you're playing it. They're 30 to 60 minute sort of episodes. They're titled. They revolve around an individual case. Even though there's sort of the larger plot happening, you're focusing sort of on investigation by investigation. And those stories tap from actual real world headlines. If you went through the LA Times, you could find articles about crimes that match up pretty closely, if not verbatim match crimes in LA Noir. Not the least of which is the Black Dahlia murder. They kind of take their creative liberties and spin on it and make it, sort of a series of murders, and say that, it's not that it went unsolved, it's that they solved it, but they couldn't reveal that they solved it for reasons. So the game obviously takes, real world inspiration, then kind of goes in its own direction with it. But this colors everything they do. What's illegal? What's immoral? How do people feel about the way you act in game? Cops may be more or less concerned about a crime in 1949 based on who it happens to than they would, today, or they investigate it differently, right? DNA evidence isn't a thing. Trying to match up weapons through serial numbers, licenses, being tags inside cars, all those period
even like
elements.
cell phones. Like you have to jump out of your car and find a payphone to call the police station to then go back to go. Like,
right. Yeah, and they're sitting there like looking through, like trying to find the
phone
address of a
book.
place, right? And even the game's storytelling and pacing, that it uses objects that are contemporary to tell its stories. It uses newspapers as tools to create mid-game flashbacks to kind of fill in narrative gaps sort of on the overarching story.
The other thing that's important is where it is located. So for LA Noir, it's obviously the entire city. And for most of Noir, it's usually an urban landscape. You are kind of treating the city as another character, depending on how well the character knows it. For Cole, he's returning to it, so it's kind of like a stranger a little bit. It's a little bit hostile. It's a little bit dark. It's a little bit scary. It's a little bit vast. And then you're experimenting with visiting all of these different places that you wouldn't normally go because you have to for work, like these gambling dens, hotel rooms, seedy waterfront warehouses, which is a favorite noir landscape. But LA Noir lets you kind of examine all these places with a purpose because you have to for work. And then at night at the big city is when it rains. And that's a noir trope. The filmmakers I guess they admitted that it looks cool when it rains. The city looks neat when the streets are all shiny and slick. And also there's a reason that people are not on the street because it's raining. So that happens a lot in LA Noir, but not during gameplay. During the day, it's normally sunny, but then at night, during a lot of these evening scenes where you're like casing somebody or somebody's casing you, there's a lot of these rain scenes. And then at night, the finale is in the sewers, in the rain, And that, again, becomes sort of another character in the final scene.
May I interject something? And he walked by night. Unless I got my movie wrong, if you go back and look at that, you may find, I think Jack Webb is in that. And that is really, if you look at some of the conversations in it, that is almost the precursor to Dragnet.
It is, yeah. So
yeah.
it is. He Walked by Night was a documentary style telling of a sort of a crippled scene, and it is maybe the one that matches up to LA Noir the most in terms of,
Especially the finale.
right, stylism. Yeah, the finale is ripped almost verbatim, but the style of it too, the way that it goes through explaining how different elements of policing are used. You know, building composite sketch, the way that they cover areas and kind of close off the sewers, and yeah, it's very much they're part and parcel. But I guess the other thing is Cole he's both a man for his time and place, and he's also a little bit outside of it because he's a video game protagonist. Like he has this idealism and his duty, and you sort of the game is always portraying him as this, for lack of better words, he's a goody two shoes. All the other members of his unit are a little more jaded. They've been in the force longer. Some of them are on the take. But he sort of sticks by the book. This eventually later proves to be an intentional decision and a character flaw, and as he's kind of a dynamic character that starts to grow out of it a little. But it's also, I think you noted, there's a morality issue to it too.
Right. So there's a little bit of a weird thing with LA Noir specifically. You know it's in the 40s, but a lot of the way Cole responds to things is a modern version. So like if somebody is interviewing a woman, he will treat them with respect, whereas his coworkers will not, because that was traditionally what you did in the 40s. You kind of treated them like dirt because they were beneath you, or they were, a prostitute and they didn't deserve your time. And so I feel like he was sort of the viewpoint from today's world, seeing that world in his time, which is a mind bend.
So let's get a little bit into the people of Noir.
The way you wear your hat, the way you sip your tea, the memory of all that. No, they can't take that away from me.
The way your smile just beams, the way you sing off key, the way you haunt my dreams.
No, they can't take that away from me. We may never meet again on that bumpy road to love.
But I'll always keep the memory of
the way you hold your knife,
the way we dance till 3,
the way you changed my life. Hey, no, they can't take that away from me.
No,
You can't take that away from me.
All right, so for our next subject, kind of going over a lot of the archetypes for characters in noir, our game lens here is going to be Telltale's The Wolf Among Us. So let's start looking at the gentleman of film noir. Gentleman said very loosely. The Wolf Among Us combines fairy tale characters that we know with the characteristics of noir archetypes, which can be helpful because you know a little bit about the characters. You have some extrinsic knowledge if you're familiar with the fairy tales coming in, so it lets you examine sort of how they've changed, right? If you're familiar with characters like the Big Bad Wolf or Bluebeard, you can see that the noir version or noir representation of them, you come in with some knowledge, so you get more understanding of the noir side of things or how they are represented that way because you know what elements of their character are or aren't necessarily from noir specifically. And these break down into typically anti-heroes, anti-villains, and some level of power structure that's been corrupted in some way. Let's start with the anti-hero. So you play as the anti-hero in The Wolf Among Us, Bigby, or the Big Bad Wolf. He, like most anti-heroes, has some mortal ambiguity. He's got a fairly fatalistic outlook. He's got some level of alienation from society. In his case, there's an issue with fables interacting with mundanes, but there's also the issue of he's the big bad wolf, and a lot of the other characters in sort of this fairy tale community are rightfully afraid of him because of who he is. So even though he's sort of this hard-boiled detective and he fits this standard noir stereotype, he's also bringing this additional characterization into the story. Now, detective is sort of the most common thing, and I guess he's technically the sheriff, although they are very similar in the way that they act in game. It should be stated that anti-heroes in noir movies run the gamut in terms of what profession they have, and oftentimes profession is one of the few things you actually know about them. We meet someone who's a boxer, we meet someone who is a detective, we meet someone who is an insurance salesman, right? And they are otherwise typically fairly mundane characters, but their profession helps frame them in a way that we understand the troubles they run into and the eventual calamities that occur from them.
As a foil to that, the anti-villain kind of lightens up the villain aspect, whereas the anti-hero kind of darkens up the hero trope. So the anti-villain is mostly, he thinks he's doing good, or he could be doing good, but the way they're going about doing that is villainous or evil, or they could be going along with whatever the hero is doing until it kind of behooves them to do a heel turn and do whatever they want based on how greedy they are. And in this case, for the Crooked Man, he's sort of an affable evil villain. He is a loan shark. People owe him money, but he thinks he's doing good for the people because where would they be without him? He never gets his hands dirty because he's only the one saying to kill so-and-so, but he's not actually doing so. The murder. So towards the end, Bigsby kind of gets his dues. There are different ways Bigsby can interrogate him to kind of get the answers he wants from the Crooked Man. I found that really interesting about this game, that you can treat the anti-hero kind of an extreme, kind of like in Mass Effect, like as an extreme renegade mode where he's like, he goes into big bad wolf mode and rips your arm off or can kill you, or he can just like sweet talk you into something. And with the Crooked Man, you can get different ways of getting confession from him, and then ultimately how to sentence him like to death or turn him into a raven and imprison him forever.
And he operates as sort of an external power source, right? You think of things like mob bosses in these movies, who again, they create their own separate power structures. And this is important because if the heroes or the victims, especially of these movies, could use existing, power structures, if they were pure in a sense, it would remove a lot of the drama from the stories. But usually, one of the things in noir is that something's wrong with the existing power structures, right? The cops are crooked. The politicians are also crooked. The mailman is crooked.
Everyone's getting paid off.
Everyone's morality is on a Dutch angle. Bluebeard sort of exemplifies this. He's very suave, he's political, but he is personally motivated, and he does not really have the best interests of Fabletown at heart. He's a very power-hungry individual who sees the opportunities that the problems that arise in The Wolf Among Us cause to try to accede to power himself. He claims that he deserves to be involved because he's got a financial stake in it, right? That he's been funding things in Fabletown. But because his former career is as a serial killer who primarily killed women, Bluebeard oftentimes comes off as very narcissistic, very misogynistic, and sort of paints himself as the sort of perfect scummy politician in game.
And again, speaking of crooked cops, some cops are useless and dirty, and this one, Grimble, is a perfect combination of both. In most noir stories, the bad guys in the stories are the cops. And Grimble is one of only 2 named characters in the entire game that don't actually speak at all. He just sits at his desk and sleeps the entire time. So, I mean, nice work if you can get it, I guess.
We should use that song. All right. Let's move on to the ladies.
So the ladies were interesting. In this game specifically, they really don't touch so much on a femme fatale. My take on it is that the original, the first person you meet is this princess turned prostitute. Her name is Faith. She kind of flirts with you a little bit, and then she turns up dead. So I guess the fatale is that she is dead. Which turns it on its head. French for fatal woman or woman to die for. She's typically the client that goes into like the detective's office and says, I need you to find my husband, or has a case for you. And then it turns into she's your lover, or she will pretend to be your lover until she will turn on you. So I think that is Faith. But there's another term that is kind of intertwined with it called the vamp, which is sort of a femme fatale, but without any feelings. And that term comes from Rudyard Kipling's
Rudyard Kipling.
His poem, The Vampire, which stems from like a woman with supernatural powers who can draw you in, kind of like a succubus, who can like take your essence. And in this game, Bloody Mary is sort of that character. She has a little bit of like supernatural powers that none of the other Fabletown characters have. She is sexy, but not in a way that she would like fall in love with you. It's just sex. She likes to fight with people. She's not really a damsel in distress kind of thing. She's more like a Poison Ivy kind of character.
Yeah, there's a very heavy sort of assassin vibe that comes from the character. She's probably the most lethal of the Crooked Man's lieutenants. And like you mentioned, very supernatural, the ability to kind of create copies of herself, create the shards, pass through mirrors. So again, tapping the fable side of things, right? The story of the character, and then kind of adding the noir side to it. And then there's 2 others that are a little lighter, or at least easier, perhaps for the protagonist to cope with. The first is the Girl Friday. This is sort of like the faithful servant, I guess, if you want to bond terms, of like a money penny of sorts.
Right.
This is someone who is helping the hero. They usually work for the hero or alongside the hero. At critical junctures, they can fill in information gaps. They can provide clues or key items.
There's usually a little bit of like sexual tension there, like they like him, but he doesn't see her that way. In this, again, they kind of turn it on its ear a little bit in this, where you have the feeling that Bigsby has feelings for Snow, but she's an ice queen, so she's not going to reciprocate. And also, Snow is actually your boss, so it's a little bit changed in this way. But of course, she goes to you for help. She's the one coming to you for advice and guidance. And
it's a very complicated
protection.
work environment.
Yes.
Yeah.
HR.
And then finally, we have the chanteuse. This is the lounge singer. Every lounge that you go to in a film noir is going to have a sultry female singing a torch song, usually in a long evening gown. Usually you've got, drunk men looking melancholy sitting at the tables. This is perhaps because she may have her own issues, her own dramas to cope with. She may be a damsel in some way, or again, like Girl Friday, she has the opportunity to sort of provide assistance or information to the protagonist. But it's usually because the protagonist will feel some sort of connection. The song is too entrancing, sort of a siren effect, or something's being communicated with body language or the words of the song that are sort of a hint that there's something deeper than just the artistic presentation of the music. In The Wolf Among Us, it's Nerissa, the Little Mermaid, is the chanteuse here. She's a dancer. She's a friend of Faith. She's a key connection in the story in that she has insider information, but struggles to, because of an enchantment, struggles to provide that information at first. And it's not really clear throughout the presentation of the game, again, getting to that noir mystery angle, how much she knows, how much she is maybe stringing people along versus how much she can not tell versus how much she won't tell. And that careful interplay in the way that they very slow burn that plot device keeps the tension going throughout until the end of the game.
And here's my favorite chanteuse.
You had plenty money, 1920. You let other women make a fool of you. Why don't you do right like some other man?
MAGFest next year.
Get out of here.
She's married to Roger Rabbit.
Yeah. What a lucky girl.
Okay, so visual aesthetic, which we kind of touched on a little bit with the German Expressionism because they took a lot of those styles with them. But the first thing they mention is chiaroscuro, which means Italian for light and dark. This is a visual trope with stark contrast for dramatic effect. And specifically in the game Grim Fandango, they started designing it with this concept in mind. A lot of Peter Chan's artwork, when he first drew it and sent it over to Tim, was already black and white, was dark with shadows, had like Venetian blinds with like the slits in it, like you can see here with Meche at the desk. These they're high drama. These are things that when you start introducing color, it's hard to keep that integrity. So it's something that they worked on very much for Grim Fandango to kind of keep that light and dark play, even though they started integrating color into everything. They also used lighting to create other effects like shadows of men running away against like a wall in an alley or the fog. Grim Fandango also was struggling with, it was their first 3D game at the time, and they were learning how to do things from 2D to 3D, so they had artists who were used to already integrating lighting into their backgrounds. So they had to yell at the artists multiple times to not light the murals, to not light the backgrounds, because they were gonna pop the lights in there to make it 3D.
Yeah, it's the difference between like painting the texture as if it was already shaded versus painting it completely flat, and then allowing the engine to do the shading through projected light. And monochrome, obviously a lot of film noir is monochrome because of the technology at the time, but monochrome is also sort of it's a technique to desaturate and to emphasize light instead of hue. Grim Fandango doesn't do this a lot, but it does do it in choice locations. Underwater, everything is given sort of this blue monochrome hue to sort of simulate the darkness and the depth of it all. But they do also do something very interesting with the Land of the Living. The Land of the Living is kind of washed out. It's got sort of a cut out.
Almost like a 2D kind of magazine.
Yeah, it's as if the human world were a ransom letter. And they kind of cut it up and divide it in a way that it's so distinct from the Land of the Dead that it feels alien and stark in a way that, if you were on the other side of things, it might feel, flip-wise. And then angles, the way the game is perceived. The film noir loves to utilize, I mentioned earlier, the Dutch angle, the idea that you would kind of set the whole scene a little bit on a tilt, right? It makes it a little unsettling. It kind of unevens perspective. It helps for things like pursuit to give a sense of motion and distance. And Grim Fandango definitely uses a lot of this because it has these static camera angles. The backgrounds were all drawn based on as you mentioned, the concept art that Peter Chen sketched out. So if you think, I guess other game examples, things like an early Resident Evil, where you have these static cameras in locations and based on where you go, like room to room, locale to locale, these angles are already kind of pre-presented. So it allowed them to use these same sort of jarring perspectives in Grim Fandango. But part of it was also they were limited by the engine. They were taking things like Scum and other LucasArts engines that they had and trying to sort of retrofit them and use them to make this 3D game. So they were sort of forced to create flat backgrounds that look like 3D backgrounds and then create invisible alpha layers for things like where you can move and where you can't move and how things scale on screen based on where they're standing on the screen, like an XY space. So there was a lot of like complicated technical back-end stuff just to present really what was things moving in what looked like 3D space. And this takes us now to writing style. So we talked a little bit about how things look, and now let's talk about what things they talk about. Our game, in this sense, or the lens we're going to use this time, is Max Payne. The first thing is no exposition and a quick resolution. There's very little exposition. You're thrown into the action right away. Usually they're just simple details like time, place. We mentioned character's occupation is usually something you'll find out right at the beginning of a noir. From the introduction, Max Payne, you immediately get that it's winter in New York City, who he works for, and why he's out for revenge. And this gets us to the quick resolutions. You immediately know what he's dealing with. The game will deal with that problem over the course of it, but the resolution for Noir usually happens in a pretty quick collapse at the end of the story.
Yeah, it's like going down a drain. It just happens.
And then in this case, Max Payne discovers the head of the conspiracy that he's going after, and there's a very large, violent, concluding series of explosions and collapsing things and more explosions. It's a very, very summer blockbuster.
For narrations... Oh.
Like inner monologue and stuff?
Yeah, so narrations and voiceovers, like they started using in Citizen Kane. That was one thing that they did a lot in Max Payne. Also, it helped kind of bridge the gap between watching him shoot a million people and knowing that it was for a reason, that it's to, there's a revenge purpose for it. It's not just to shoot people. And then the flashbacks also kind of help give you that background. And that's something that is a noir trope that every noir, I think, that we've watched had. You would go back in time, figure out like why a character thinks a certain way or does a certain thing because this thing happened in the past. And that it helps explain the motivations.
Yeah, and it's similar to movies like Double Indemnity, where Walter Neff is sort of confessing at the beginning and then flashbacks. Max Payne starts with him sort of at the top of this building at the very end of the game, let me tell you how I got here, right? And flashes back, and then you get to the start of the game. So that same narrative pattern of, this is the end of the story. Allow me to say that the story you're about to hear is coming from the perspective of the protagonist. That's important if you need to worry about things like an unreliable narrator, that you know that you're hearing this through the lens and the perspective of the main character. This is really, really helpful in video games because oftentimes you are playing as the main character the whole time. You're in the main character's perspective, whether it's third person or first person. So the sort of the film trope meshes up nicely with gameplay here because you are experiencing the game through their perspective. Right. So it might as well be a flashback from that character.
Yeah, especially for like a game like a shooter where you're not like figuring things out and using the key on the door, you're just shooting people. But now with flashbacks and narrations, you have, why, and you have a background.
Yeah. I used to joke about this, but like Max Payne literally replaced his feelings with guns. And most of the dialogue in film noir, it's witty banter. It's very rapid. The characters, it's almost Aaron Sorkin-esque at times, where they're too clever. Like, human beings don't think of retorts as fast as film noir characters think of retorts. It's really fast paced. It's back. It's forth. It makes the characters seem more jaded, more intelligent than their surroundings, but also very defensive. So it plays well with sort of their emotions. Max Payne makes very, very liberal use of this. It is a comic noir. There are these panels, like you can see on the right, that are used as cutscenes throughout play, where he delivers a series of, you're a cookie full of arsenic style one-liners, and kind of presents his world.
What's neat about that is they've taken away the player's ability to choose what you're going to say. So all of that dead air of like the player sitting there and thinking like, what am I going to ask this person? That all gets taken away. And so with these panels of comic, it's just bam, 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 bam. And that helps with the pacing of the game.
Yeah, no dialogue wheel, instant feedback, and you get that timing that kind of matches that film timing.
Right.
Max Payne does work as a cop, but most film noir characters, we use the term sort of like average Joe, right? This is just someone who gets caught up in this larger world around them.
So they kind of took from like those big, like Scarface kind of like big crime things, and they stepped back and did like, well, how would the average Joe get caught up in crime? Why would the average Joe murder somebody's husband? And like put you into that frame. And this is a little bit like that. Like, why would Max Payne, the policeman, go on this rampage?
Right. I know one we really enjoyed watching, Scarlet Street. Mm-hmm. Right. Edward G. Robinson he's an accountant for, I think a bank.
Right. He's a bank teller.
He's a teller. And, someone is meek and innocent and, he gets abused at home. All he does is just take the wrong way home one day and run into the wrong person. And it sets him into
femme fatale.
Right. A 2-hour death spiral. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's a very noir thing, to take a character and kind of put them in over their head and watch them do their level best to try to make the situation work before it all falls apart. That kind of gets us to this term of cautionary tales, right? It's this fear that if you stray, if you don't, just keep your head down, do your 9 to 5, go home, rinse and repeat, doom. The term male nightmare gets thrown around with film noir sometimes. It's this idea that the stories are told from the perspective of, it's a very male gaze genre. And it's very built on sort of, warning men, there's a way to behave and there's a way not to behave. And if you behave the way you're not supposed to, 2 hours later,
you'll get what's coming to them.
You're floating in a pool. Yeah. And this darkness of the film, right? We have dark films now, but remember that a lot of this stemmed from the times were, very depressing. It was kind of smack dab between the First and Second World War, or after. You had all of the sort of the angst that came from the Depression. You have the stories, these gritty crime dramas and people trying to kind of endure in the early 20th century. So the American film noir is really something that is heartless, coldly efficient. It's blasé about things like political corruption and just kind of assumes them to be status quo. And Max Payne mirrors that. He gets increasingly disillusioned over the course of the game, although he's also subjected to all sorts of trauma, endless killing, unwanted drugs being thrown into his system, learning sort of more about his own failings and sort of coming to terms with, being responsible for things he doesn't, realize he is at the start of the game.
Poor Max.
Yeah, he's got it rough. Some movie examples, obviously things like Dick Tracy or Sin City, if you're looking for that sort of that comic noir style. And then I guess one other noir style that we'll touch on today is the neo-noir.
I went
but first,
rummaging in the basement of Remedy HQ and I found this box, and in it a familiar looking leather jacket. I wonder if I should try it on. Maybe I should.
And on that note, Birthdays are like regrets. They just keep coming. Each one a new scar that slows you down and drags you closer to your grave.
So that's Sam Lake. He's the author behind the first 2 Max Payne games, and he for the 20th anniversary of the game just did that little snippet with the voice actor.
Such writing.
Right. So let's talk neo-noir a little bit. And our game for neo-noir is going to be Snatcher. But we're also going to talk a little bit about game mechanics. We're going to kind of get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of things you can do or should do to kind of capture that noir feel in a video game.
So Snatcher specifically is a good example of making a game with difficult choices. A lot of times you are forced with the menu system to make a decision and you have no idea what the right decision is, which requires a lot of saving and I don't know. Like for example here, jump out, give up, hit cliff, drive into sand pile, or press button. I don't know. Where's the hint book? None of these are good options.
Yeah, and those difficult choices, right? Some of that stems from the failings of the characters. Gillian is not always presented in this game to be sort of this really super talented or sort of ruthlessly efficient investigator. At times, he really does kind of bumble his way through things, and the game forces you to make decisions that demonstrate, through the story that he's making mistakes. But also that he likes to do what he does. Noir likes to give characters licenses to behave badly. It's a chance to indulge in things like larceny and lust. And Gillian is a prime example of this in Snatcher. He will make advances on pretty much anything. And he employs some pretty heavy strong-arm tactics when he's trying to get, press people to see whether or not they're snatchers. He's not exactly a moral paragon. And he definitely takes full license of that. The game also utilizes something film started with sort of audio cues. The idea that there's a little bit of a note or a chime, a change in the music, a tone of some kind that gives you an idea that something's happened. You've discovered a key piece of evidence, something's changed in the environment, you might be in danger. Snatcher has this often repeated sound effect that lets the player know when they learn or find something important, which is really key because the presentation of the game is usually mountains of text. The art is, the pixel art's beautifully done, and it's fun to go back and play this, especially if you have a really good display. But it is still a big, heavy it's a text game. You're consuming a lot of text, and it can be easy to kind of, your eyes glaze over a bit sometimes. You might miss a key detail. So that audio cue helps the player kind of snap back into attention and realize that whatever's being displayed on the screen at this exact moment is probably, of key importance. And then finally, multiple endings. Film noir usually has a single ending, and that single ending is usually, it's usually the character meets a grisly fate, right? The nice thing about video games is our players don't assume that we're going to do that to them. The occasion where a game has a character die happens, and to LA Noir's credit, they follow through on this. And although some characters survive, Cole doesn't, and it really does play into the standard film noir trappings of character has failings become character's downfall, and character is defeated. But most games can't.
Or is he redeemed?
I mean,
okay, we'll do that over the bar.
Yeah, we've got it. Time.
We'll discuss.
But most game noirs, the games we assume are to be defeated, victorious, right? That the player's assumptions coming into a game are a little different than the player's assumptions coming into a movie. So
right. I mean, you're designing a game usually with a sequel in mind.
There's that too, right? It's when you design the stuff, it's the opportunity to give the player fantasies, and very few players, have power fantasies common, death spiral fantasies, hopefully way less common, hopefully.
So there's some hope for your protagonist in the game world.
And with that, it's 4:26. So in 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, we've got time for Q&A. We've got about 5 minutes, I think, roughly, of Q&A time here. And then I guess anything beyond that we can take outside. But questions? Sure.
At the beginning, when you spoke of Metropolis, I would have never thought of that as film noir. I understand the darkness after World War I and everything. How is that more film noir than just some sort of a odd science fiction thing?
It's more of a precursor to noir. It's German expressionism, which was like the baby of noir.
That was sort of the artistic seed that got carried over to the United States and created the film noir, less so than it being one itself.
Right, and that director then moved to the U.S. to do other noir films.
Yeah, Lang would come over and do stuff like...
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right, yeah. Yep. Here in the red.
So I noticed a few themes that you guys discussed, and that being like part of noir. I also noticed have been like present in like pre-modern literature. For example, like a critical flaw leading to someone's demise. I noticed that in Shakespeare, and especially in Dostoevsky, I noticed that, for example, indulgement in calamity as an instalment of responsibility and stuff like that. So, is that largely coincidental, or do you think that pre-modern literature, like, because I know you mentioned this kind of popped up sort of early civilization, would you say pre-modern literature has like a specific place in being influential on noir?
I think it is influential, and I think because a lot of noir is based on novels, a lot of those authors had those seeds in their mind as well. Some of them were saying that a lot of the main characters are sort of, they've already given up to the wind that fate is going to take them on this journey, that, they don't really have a choice in the matter. So I think it is something that's kind of already, they've obviously read, Chandler has read Shakespeare. I mean, I don't know about the magazines, the Pulp Fiction magazines.
Right, yeah. And then there's also the issue that just like a lot of existing narrative frameworks, right, kind of migrate from genre to genre over time, whether they're doing transmediation, like is in the case with these film noirs, where they're taking these, these pulp crime novels and moving them over, or if it's just sort of existing ethical and moral structures, right? Because a lot of it, like you said, is character demonstrates some sort of vice, character is punished for demonstrating vice, right? And that's time immemorial at that point. Mm-hmm. It's just the way the genre manages that concept. Yeah. Two behind.
I think a central theme of noir that you touched on is loneliness. But a lot of games are multiplayer, and you talked a little bit about the tropes of noir. How do you go about doing sort of multiplayer noir without just fitting players into the characters, the sort of standard characters you saw in the noir?
I'll admit that's kind of tricky, right? Obviously, film noir is a very isolating thing, and the games that we played were single-player games. If you were to try to expand this to multiplayer, I think you have to look more to setting. Setting can be a very powerful tool. I think of things like Sin City, and a lot of the scenes in that movie, there's the single character, right? There are scenes about Marv and the like, but there are large enough casts, there are large enough groups. You could probably do something. You may not be able to do something with like a large cast, sort of a character shooter or something like that, but you may be able to do something a little more depersonalized. The sort of the Prohibition era might lend for something interesting if you wanted to say like a Battlefield style game where, you have the sort of that Art Deco style, you have the monochrome, you have sort of the hardware of the time, the motivations of the time, but don't necessarily get into the individual personalities. The thing might be a little easier for a first shot at it. But yeah, I mean, there's a few different ways you could take it. Certain genres lend themselves better to multiplayer. It's hard when, we take...
Well, okay, so wait a minute. I think you can fight, that could be the central issue, or like the central like in Genesis Noir, you're playing as a character trying to figure out somebody's murder. And as the game progresses, you go from black and white into color. Kind of like, like Wizard of Oz, when you open the door and you're in Oz and there's color. So maybe the purpose of this game is to be confronted with modes of communication like a telephone or a telegraph or newspaper, and overcoming that loneliness or overcoming that fear of connecting. And then the point is to connect and then somehow do it multiplayer style so you can or get rewarded for connecting to people.
Yeah, awesome question.
Sorry, that was...
We had one here in the back.
Is that we brought up a few games directed by Shadowy, and Shadowy, the Blackwell series, specifically sets its games in New York City. So I was wondering if I have seen a few films and actually, there's Brick and others that actually do take Noir outside the city. Mm-hmm. Do you think a game could still pull that off, visually and the rest? Because I've mostly seen Noir games really still featuring that city aesthetic because a lot of the characters move around. Right.
I think the problem with taking it into the countryside is it almost turns it into a horror game. So there is a little, you kind of have to, I think, keep analyzing it as you're going.
Yeah, there's a couple tricks there, right? Street lights, if you don't have those anymore, right? A dark field is a very different scene to capture than, a city street.
I mean, there are film noir movies that are in more urban settings.
And I mean, even LA Noir at times is dealing with suburbia, right? It's going through single family home neighborhoods. In fact, it actually tackles the idea of building these prefab homes for veterans as part of its storyline. So, it does wander into sort of outside of the immediate city limits at times. But yeah, that's an awesome question. Here in front.
I kind of wanted to build on what they were saying, because you were talking about some things kind of turning it on their head in The Wolf Among Us. I don't think that's necessarily such a hard thing to do with the noir genre as a rule. Whereas you could say, the typical line is, she was a small town girl coming to a big city. Why not just turn that around? Why not have it be Nowhereville, Indiana?
Right. I mean, they do that now with Jessica, what's that show? Jessica Jones. She's the detective or you know what I mean? She's the anti-hero instead of,
More of a setting issue, though.
Right.
Still, New York City.
Right. Well, we mentioned Broadchurch. We were talking about this before the panel. Does that take place in sort of a more...
Yeah, that's rural, definitely.
Right. That's much more isolated, but it still has a lot of that noir characterization.
Yeah.
I think
I think we got one more.
We have one more, and then we're up on time.
And we're around the weekend,
That's true. We can also take stuff outside after this, yeah.
What do you think is the appeal of noir today, since the classic noir period is 60 years ago?
Well, if you look outside, everyone's in a terrific mood right now. Everything's going great. Nothing is wrong.
Nothing is wrong.
These are the salad days. So yeah, I mean, we can always kind of channel, the emotions of the time, the angsts and insecurities people feel, and tell stories using those, right? The technology is changing, neo-noir films.
I think too, having the set of limitations kind of helps if you're building a game using this framework in mind. It helps you build a game with structure. I'm not going to use color because I'm doing it full on black and white noir. And I think that kind of, especially as somebody who's starting out, it gives you some things to look out and research, and it can start a gem of an idea that you wouldn't really have if you just have the whole palette of everything to work with.
Yeah, game jams are very good about this. They'll give you a lot of qualifiers or recommendations. Global Game Jam will pick certain subjects or words and concepts, and that's when you build your game around. There's additional features and things like Ludum Dare, where if you make games using specific criteria, and again, it's that narrowing the focus helps you it breaks the inertia a little bit. It makes the whole thing seem a little less daunting if you know what you're kind of tackling to start with. All right, and with that, thank you all for coming out here. If you have any other questions, we'll take them out in the lobby.
Thank you.